Well, happy Thursday to everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started here. I am Sandy Emerson. I'm your host today, and we are going to talk about, is flood risk on the rise? Just to give you some background, I am a licensed agent here in the state of Florida, which I'm in the Tampa Bay area, and my co-host today is Carrie Lang, and we will be having hopefully a nice conversation on, is there really some new flooding that's actually happening and moving, and if I could talk today, excuse me, all over the country. Since I do happen to live in a coastal state, yeah, we have our share of all kinds of fun, but it's happening all over the country. So bear with us as we sort of maneuver along here. Before we hit to a couple of poll questions, I will say we are going to take a look at the objectives here. We're going to take and have a discussion about what is a flood and what the flood zones actually are. Some talk about flood mapping and what causes flooding all across the country, and how they assess when they do make the decision to put people in a high risk area. So now, Carrie, if you'd like to go ahead and launch that first poll question. This sort of gives us an idea of where you're coming from on your side of the desk. So if everybody would just please answer, give us a general idea. Just so you guys know, again, I am a licensed agent here in the state of Florida forever, and I am one of those that when I first started was terrified of writing a flood policy because it was scary. And there was no one back in those days to do any kind of training. We didn't have these little classes or CEs or anything to actually get us going and point us in the right direction. So flood is still one of those products that does scare a lot of people, not only us, but our insureds. So our first question here is, what experience do you have? So we have a fair amount of people that have written some flood policies, have some knowledge, and a few out there that you are novices. Hopefully we're not going to scare you today when we start talking about some of the things that can happen. Carrie, if you'd like to go ahead and share the results.
Sure, thanks, Sandy.
Great. Okay. Let's move on here. So the first thing we need to talk about, or the first thing we need to be very aware of, is what is a flood. And I have learned very, very, in all the wrong ways, that making up your own definition of what a flood is definitely, as an agent, not in your best interest. The best thing to do, and as you can see by the screen, this is a bullet point of what the NFIP actually says the definition is, but I always like to read it, and I caution any of you that are new to flood as a product, selling as a product, to definitely get to know this definition I'm about to read. And if you're unsure of what to say or how to do it, you can actually go to the NFIP FEMA publications and get a copy of the summary of coverages. It's on there, and that way if anybody asks you, well, what is a flood or what does that mean? Yes, of course we know it's rising water, but there's a little bit more to it than that. And again, I'm just going to read it directly from the summary of coverages. It's a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area or 2 or more properties, at least one of which is your property or your insured's property, from overflow of inland or tidal waters, unusual and rapid accumulation of or runoff of surface waters from any source, and then we're going to talk about mud flow and versus landslide. But that's the key. 2 things to point out here. Number 1, it's from any source. So it doesn't have to be Mother Nature. It can be man-made. It could be a water main break. So it doesn't have to be Mother Nature. So this is not just a coastal issue when we're talking about flooding. The second thing is that it's any 2 properties, not any 2 buildings, but any 2 properties. So it can be your insured's home and the street out front. It could be the building that you're in right now and another building 2 or 3 blocks away, as long as it's from the same source. Now, one thing that has come out recently with the NFIP, the newest summary of coverages, actually has changed the wording a tiny bit. Their words, it is simple terms, and the new definition that they're publishing is a flood is an excess of water on land that is normally dry, affecting 2 or more acres of land or 2 or more properties. For example, damage caused by a sewer backup is covered if the backup is the direct result of flooding. If the sewer backup is not caused directly by flooding, the damage is not covered. I think that's a little bit of confusing when you start talking about sewer backup, but the bottom line is it is rising water. Now we're going to talk about the definition. If you bear with me, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue going on here. There we go. We talk about mud flow versus landslide. As you can see in this slide, on the left-hand side is considered a mud flow. It's almost the consistency of a chocolate shake. So it's very liquid. It's very liquid in nature. And there's more water to it than there is actually mud or dirt. Whereas on the right-hand side of this picture, you have a landslide where the land itself, it's not wet particularly, but it has just collapsed. It could be down the side of a mountain. It could be down the side of a hill. Either way, it's not liquid in nature. One of the ways that we tell everybody to kind of think about this, and of course this is not something that happens all over the country, but it happens in enough places to make it valid. If you think of the mud flow as like the consistency of a chocolate shake versus the landslide, which is the consistency of a chocolate cake. Remember, we cover the shake, but we don't cover the cake. Makes it a little bit easier. And by the way, this webinar today is only going to run about probably a half an hour, 45 minutes at the most, so we should be well under any time constraints going forward. So let's talk about flood zones. This is one of those things that confuses a lot of people when we start talking about flood in general. Your high-risk areas, also known as SFHAs, Special Flood Hazard Areas. These are your zones that start with an A or a V as in victory. One of the things that no one ever told me when I first started doing this was, what does that mean? Well, A stands for accumulating water, so water rising from the ground up. V stands for velocity, so that's that wave action of water. So the V zones are generally around large bodies of water. You've got the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Lake Michigan areas, so large bodies of water where that wave action is going to come into play. And then you have your B, C, or X zones, which is your non-special flood hazard areas, or your non-SFHAs. These are your low to moderate risk. These, you may sometimes in this grouping also see the zone D as in determined. D is an undetermined area. They have not yet mapped it. It's probably in a very rural area. So there's no sufficient evidence one way or the other whether it's a high risk or a low risk zone. So it's an undeveloped area. And if you think about it, in the last, I would say even 10 years, we have had some hard-hitting named storms, let alone areas across the country that have been inundated with flood for various reasons. We've had dams break. We've had North Carolina area had several dams break during, I believe it was Matthew. We have areas across the country where levees and dams and just infrastructure is so old that it's breaking left and right. So those are the areas, even though one may think we never flood here, those things can happen at a moment's notice. It can happen for any reason whatsoever. But then you start talking about some of these named storms. You've got Harvey in Houston. Less than 17% of the people that had flooding actually had a flood insurance policy. Most of the area in Harvey that flooded were in that low to moderate risk zone. They were the people who didn't think it was ever going to happen to them because, quote, the bank said they weren't going to require it. And one thing to remember, especially those of you who are new to this, there's a huge difference between need and required. If you live where it rains, or you live anywhere near there may be a water tower or a water main, you can have a flooding event. It can happen anywhere, any place, any time, and it, again, is not just something to deal with Mother Nature. It can happen from man-made issues. It can happen from lack of maintenance. It can happen because, as in Harvey, the storm came on shore. Yeah, Houston's close to the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, but it's not sitting on the Gulf of Mexico. This was a storm that came inland and sat there for nearly 3 days, if I'm not mistaken, and ended up having, in some cases, 5 feet of water in the structures, in the buildings. I have a friend who lives up in LaGrange, Texas, which I believe is about 250 miles northwest sort of Houston. She had the effects, totally lost everything in her house, lost her house and everything in it for that matter, and is still trying to recover from it. So this is not something that is just indicative to coastal. Again, we've had so much flooding across the country all over that had nothing to do with the named storm. A rainstorm can form and just sit in an area, doesn't have to be named, that's for sure. If you look at the screen too, again, Irma here in Florida. I happened to go through Irma. Luckily, I was right on the edge of it and didn't get a lot of the, definitely got none of the flooding, but got very little of the wind as well. But again, less than 12% had an actual flood policy in place. Michael and Matthew, less than 5%. These are coastal areas that have minimal policies in force when these storms hit. Across the country, it's even worse. And again, you don't have to live right on that water. You could possibly live upstream or downstream near a river and the storm actually be 20 miles away from you, but by the time it comes downstream, now it's your area that floods. I just noticed that Eustace had put on here, and I just want to read it, and on top of everything else, well, let's see, wait, so let me go back. Just look at the video coming out of Canton, Mississippi today. Never an expert. That means you are just one mistake away from being labeled a fool. Good point. Many of the agents refrain or are afraid to talk about flood. There is no question about that. And she mentions Lumberton, North Carolina. How many times have they flooded in the last couple of years, or 10 years or so? I think twice. And it totally wiped out their entire town. I happened to drive through there months after the last time it flooded, and I was amazed at how long and how much it is taking that community to build back up. It's sad. It's sad when you see this happen. So flood mapping, everybody always asks me, well, you know, how do they make these decisions? Well, today it's a lot simpler than it was even 20, 30 years ago, because now they do a collaborative effort between engineering experts, FEMA, NFIP as one group. They go out and they get information. They do aerial shots. They do historic flooding, if there's ever been any flooding previously. Put in perspective, and we're going to talk about this in a couple of slides, there are new reasons why we are having more flooding, because when you start talking about new building, expansions of cities. I mean, most of the cities across this country, bigger cities, are just expanding. I do a lot of traveling, and it is amazing how I've seen the growth in some of the areas. And even here in Florida, every time I turn around, there's something new being built. Okay, Carrie, you want to throw up the very next poll question?
Sure thing.
This is a good one. I love this question. So What percentage of all the flood insurance claims originate in a low to moderate risk areas? Some people may be surprised. It looks like a lot of you know more than you want to admit. We'll give it a few more minutes here. Okay, if we want to go ahead and end that, I think we got everybody and share the results. Somebody's really, really smart out there because, yes, the answer is correct. 25 to 30% of all claims actually submitted are in the low-risk areas, so those B, C, and X areas. Those are the ones submitted. These aren't even the ones that didn't have a flood policy in place. And although we don't cover this in this webinar, when you start talking about agents, insureds who rely on the federal government for that disaster assistance, that's a whole nother conversation because most people don't realize that disaster assistance generally has to pay back. It's not free money. There are sometimes some grants involved, but it's very low numbers of repayment, or I'm sorry, payment to the insured for any of the damages. We're talking in most cases less than about $20,000. I believe Sandy, some people got about 16, but it's very, very minimal compared to what it would be for a total loss. Most of the time people are having to apply for disaster assistance, which is the other thing a lot of people don't realize. You do have to apply for it. It is a low interest loan, but it still has to be paid back, and you have to have the ability to pay it back. So you still have to qualify for it just like any other loan you would be taking out. So, Carrie, if you want to stop sharing those results, and I see that we have a question here. Let me just kind of catch up on it. Okay, Eustace is asking, any idea of when New York City is going to be remapped? We've been on every webinar this week. Yeah, I know, I recognize your name. I don't know offhand. You can do a couple of things. You can check with the floodplain manager there in, I don't know if it's going to be the county or the city of New York, or you can go online and actually look up, I'll have to get you the, and I can email it to you after the fact, get you the email address, or I'm sorry, the website where you can check when the new mappings in all areas are coming out. It's not necessarily updated as you're probably going to want to have. The best place to go to is the floodplain manager for New York City or wherever the area is you're actually wanting to find out about. And we're going to talk about this in a minute when I do a remapping, but it's an interesting process when they make that decision to do some remapping in an area. We'll get to that in just a moment. So we will. There we go. You've got the floodmap.fema.gov on there, and I have not been there, I have to say, in the last few weeks and probably the last month. It used to be you had to go through a succession of different screens, pick the state, pick the area, et cetera, but it'll walk you through that. But that's a great resource to find out where the remapping, when the remapping is going to happen. So let's talk about some of the causes for flood. We've kind of hit on a couple of those already. Obviously, heavy rains or long periods of rain. When you get that saturated soil in areas, the water just has nowhere to go. It just keeps accumulating and gets higher and higher. And there's, as I said earlier, when you have a lot of this reurbanization or this new growth in building, you find where the water used to go, which might have been an empty lot or an empty field, now has to find a new place to go. And most likely it's going to go into some of these older sections because newer construction generally means they're going to build higher, especially if it is in a high-risk area. They're going to build those new structures a little bit higher than the older ones. And by older, we may be talking just 10 years ago. It doesn't have to be something that is 30 or 40 years old. But that water is going to obviously go downhill. And it's going to devastate areas that they never thought it was ever going to happen to them before. And don't forget your deep snow, your snow melts, steep slopes where this water is going to, maybe it's raining at the top of the hill or the mountain, and by the time it accumulates and runs down, it now floods the valley or that area below it. So, you know, it can happen. Even out in the desert, I used to live out in Arizona and Nevada area. They had quite a bit of flooding. I believe it was last year in the Las Vegas area, places that no one ever thought it was ever going to happen because they're in the desert or they're in wherever. They just don't think it's ever going to happen. And again, looking at this screen, urbanization of rural areas. We've got, especially here in the Tampa Bay area, places that when I was growing up were fields, where places where where my friends in high school used to go four-wheeling out into the mud areas. These are now, you know, high-end houses or retail areas. We've got forest fires and I can't say that word, deforestation, especially out west where you've got all these fires that are going on. Well, that, when the rainy season then comes along, that water just starts running down and accumulating. So areas, again, that never thought it was ever going to flood are now flooding. One of the ones that I want to point out again is the aging dams and levees. I was trying to get the website to this particular TV show I saw in the middle of the night a couple days ago, but it was called The Races or something like that, and it was talking about our aging dams and levees and what's happening and how many millions and millions of dollars it was going to take to bring them up to safety codes for flooding. What was it, California last year, the year before, that had some serious issues with the possibility of a dam breaking out there. You just can't predict it. We've got unpredictable weather. We have unpredictable levees and dams and so much growth that is going on out there that anything can happen. Another one that's a big one is, of course, the infrastructure of some of our bigger cities and water main breaks. I've been in different places, I want to say Baltimore and Madison, Wisconsin, where both, I hate to say this, but both times I was there, they had massive water main breaks, and not just one or two, there was several during the week. I know that Baltimore itself had a couple of them where they were substantial. There were a lot of losses from flooding, and again, as long as it meets the definition of a flood with the rising water and going into a structure, whether it's a house or a building, whatever the case may be, without this flood policy, it's very possible they won't get a dime, because unless an area is declared as a disaster area by our president, they will not offer any FEMA help whatsoever. So some of these more regional, local events that happen, whether it's a water main break or even a storm, if it's not declared a disaster area, FEMA's not coming in to help at all. So without this policy, our insureds are on their own. Whoops. Once again, some examples here of the dam failures, which again, going all the way back to Katrina, one of the reasons that Katrina was so devastating was when that levee failed, it just wiped out those areas. And you just don't know. Yeah, we all like to think that everything's being monitored and everything's going to be okay. But as we've seen over and over and over again, it's not necessarily true. These are just some examples here of flooding after a fire or dry slopes. Again, when that water cannot get into the ground and be soaked up, you're going to have these repetition floods over and over again. And it just keeps getting worse because our population is growing as well. And again, a lot of people don't realize that they are in I don't want to say danger, that's a little bit too strong of a word, but it's a definite possibility that they could be in harm's way and not have an idea. So many times our insureds think that the mortgage companies have a crystal ball, and if they're requiring flood, well, that's the only time they probably need a flood policy, correct? Absolutely not. As I said earlier, there is a huge difference between need and required. If you live in this country, you're pretty much going to need a flood policy because there is no such thing as not being in a flood zone. Every square inch of this country has been put into some level of a flood zone. It might be a high risk or it might be a low risk, but there is no such thing as not being in a flood zone. And for those of you who are new to flood, one of the biggest E&O factors is telling your insured, oh, you're not in a flood zone, you don't need flood. Believe me, there is a need. May not be a requirement, but there's most definitely a need. Of course, we have the big one here, the storm surge and high winds and wave action. Those of us on the coast, we know all about this. It's definitely one of those things that makes it very difficult when you decide to live in the coastal areas because you don't know, again, when that named storm is going to come up. What did we have? Forget how many we had in 2004, 2005 in this state alone. It's too unpredictable. And again, Katrina hitting the New York area. We had, the name escapes me, that hit the Vermont area, in areas that no one ever thought a storm would be coming up. I see from Denise, she's made a good point. We can tell people that if it can rain on your house, it can flood. Absolutely correct. Harvey and Imelda hit the southeast Texas hard, and so did, was it Ivan, I think, that hit Galveston Bay area. Have so many insurers that have flooded more than once in 2 years, twice in 2 years, as she said. Irene, yes, that was the one that hit the Vermont area, exactly. So you never know. You just never know. And so many people across the country think that they hear the term the 100-year flood plain or the 500-year flood plain, and they have it in their head that means it's only going to flood once every 100 years there. So not the truth. It is absolutely not what that means. Again, across the country, there's an awful lot of people who have flooded more than one time in just 1 year, let alone 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So it can happen any place, anytime, anywhere. If I haven't already said this, I'll say it again. Flooding is the #1 natural disaster in this country because you can have a flood by itself, you can have a flood and a hurricane, you can have a flood and a fire, you can have a flood and anything else. So again, the #1 natural disaster in this country. And of course, tsunamis are also covered under your flood policy. Haven't had any of those along the coastlines here, and again, this is usually up in the Pacific Rim area, but you never know. Once again, anything can happen. You get these underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Anything can happen. So how do they assess a flood risk? Again, it goes back to sort of a cooperation on many levels. They look at historic flooding. They look at remapping. One thing that happens that people don't realize, if you have a large flood event in your area, usually within the next year or two, you're going to see that area remapped. If it was a low-risk area, they're going to remap it to a high-risk area. So because they now know that area can flood. And again, it goes back to maybe in this case, in my scenario, it goes back to new building. So what was an open field 2 years ago is now a housing development. Well, that water has to go somewhere now. Well, now they know that it can accumulate in this new area that it had never flooded before. I have friends that live right on Tampa Bay that are still, well, at the end of this year they will not be, but currently are in an X zone because their particular area, even though they're right on the water, has never flooded before, or at least it hadn't until Hurricane Irma came through, and then the waters rose. Luckily, there was no property damage, but they now know that it could happen, and they did a remapping that goes into effect sometime this year. So it can take an event to trigger a remap for an area, and they're doing them faster and faster because they have all of this technology and better equipment to do this. And this is what I was referring to earlier. If you are having some remapping in your area, I urge you as agents to attend some of the town hall meetings that they offer, because generally, and I am really simplifying what I'm about to say, generally what happens when they make a decision to do a remapping in an area, they will have town halls that everyone involved can come in and find out what the new maps are going to show and who's going to be affected, how they're going to be affected, and they do this 2 or 3 times. As an agent, go in, sit back, and just listen, because you will find there are so many misconceptions about the flood program in general, about how it works, what they can do, what they can't do, who is arguing against it. So it's really eye-opening. Not only is that beneficial as an agent, but it also gives you a heads up on what's going on and who's going to be involved in these remapping areas, which is a great place to start when you're trying to increase your book of business when it comes to flood. So with that, we're pretty much done here. I said this would be a short and fast one. Do we have any additional questions that anyone would like to throw out there? I can actually unmute everyone if we do have any questions. I will go ahead and ask Carrie to go ahead and put up that last poll question, which we ask you to really fill in, let us know how we're doing on these webinars. I urge you guys, if you haven't, and I know a few of you have been on several of our webinars this week, take as many as you can, because there's a lot of information. Also on our website, on the nationalfloodservices.com website, we have some videos and some training on there as well. NFIP has some great resources to reach out to. They have publications. Take a look at some of those. If you haven't gotten one in your office, get some of the summary of coverages. They're free to you. You can download them. You can order